video is from section 2.7, which is still using absolute value functions and transformations. What I'm going to walk through is writing an equation if you're given the absolute value graph. So if you have a picture of the graph, you're going to actually have to come up with the equation that matches it. And then we'll look at a quick application problem. Alright, so if you take a look, the directions say write an absolute value equation, and you can note the picture off to the side with a few key points. I guess the first thing that I would remind you of is the equation for an absolute value situation. Okay, so absolute value. And of course, if it's not centered at the origin, you know you have some horizontal and vertical shifting going on. Maybe just one, maybe both, but it's definitely not centered at the origin. So A times the absolute value of x minus h quantity, and then plus k. So this is our generic formula. So we have to figure out what A is, what h is, and what k is. So if you take a look at the given information, you can tell that the vertex, obviously, is the point 32. And you might just know and be okay with the fact that the vertex is always hk. So automatically we know what hk is, but of course you can tell that from the origin, this graph, this particular graph, is shifted to the right 1, 2, 3, and up 2. So because it's minus h, I want to write that it's shifted over 3 and, I'll use a different color here, over 3 and up 2, to the right 3 and up 2. So it's going to be x minus 3. And then plus 2. So again, there's my h and there's my k. And last but not least, A is directional and it works like slope. So I note that I have my vertex and I have another point. So from this vertex point to the other given point, I can really just count rise over run. So for example, here, if I just literally do that, from this point I would go down 1, 2, 3, 4, and to the left 1, 2. So down 4 to the left 2 would be negative 4 over negative 2. And that, I'm sure you are okay with the fact, negative 4 over negative 2 equals 2. However, think about that. What if I was real careless with this? And again, this is why A is not slope. 2 would mean that the absolute value function is opening down. So you need to be very, very, very careful. Rule of thumb, always go to the right-hand side if that helps, or just use your logic and note that it is opening down. So actually A has to be negative 2 and not positive 2. Now, of course, if I go down, I'll erase this here, but if I go down 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and to the right 2, then I'm going to have an A value of, let me erase that instead of making such a mess. So I went down 4 and to the right 2, and then I truly get my A value. So you can always go to the right and it should work out for you, but again, please understand that that shortcut, that A is like slope, is really just to help you get that final equation. So my final equation, now that I know A is negative 2, and I knew my h and k already, and done deal. So these should be pretty simple. Worst case scenario is if you can't actually count out the slope, then use the slope formula between these 2 points to figure out what A is, because it will always work exactly like slope. Alright, last problem. This is an application problem about speedboats, and it says the number of boats B that a boat dealer sells each month of the year can be modeled by the following function. So B equals negative 15 times the absolute value of t minus 5 plus 120. So I'm just going to kind of circle there as our function, where t is the time in months, and let t equals 1 represent January. So it says, number 1 says graph the function from t values of 0 to 12, technically not including 0 and 12 because there's no equal sign. And that makes sense because if t is months, 1 being January, so this 0 through 12 would represent a full year, so that would be good enough. So things I would note, of course, is that the vertex is given. And you know that that's HK, so I can figure out H is positive 5 and K is positive 120. So I'm just going to make note of that, and then we'll be plotting some things. So there's my vertex. And A is negative 15, so that is going to be opening down and have a slope. Both lines will have a slope of 15. Now, note the graph is off to the side made for you. However, you might be required to actually sketch this. So if this were a homework problem, a nice sketch is fine. If this were an enriched assessment, then I would love to see a graph very much like this. You've got your labels, your time is months, your B-axis, your Y-axis, right, is boats sold. Then you need to think about how you want to scale things. Well, months, it makes sense, certainly makes sense to go by ones, right? You want to go 0 through 12. Boats sold kind of depends on the problem. Well, if you look at the vertex, which is definitely going to be our maximum, since this we know is opening down, right? So this point here is going to be 5, 120. So my largest B value is going to be 120. Other things you might note is the slope of your lines are going to be at a rate of 15. So, actually, if it were me, I might just scale by 15s, but then you won't land right at 120. So this graph is formatted by 20s so that your maximum is up at 120. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to plot that point. So 5, 120, that's easy to pick out. That's going to be my vertex. Now, I know that it's opening down, and I also know that the slope of my lines will be 15, but if I'm scaling by 20s, so I would have to estimate this, which is not ideal, but definitely if this were a homework problem, again, that would be okay. But, I would have to roughly go down 15 over 1, down 15 over 1, and you certainly can do that. Other things you can do is just find your extreme points. So, for example, put in 0 for T and figure out what the boat sold would have been. So off to the side, I'm just going to really quickly do that, and I know this is not anything that's, well, it shouldn't be anything that's tricky for you. So negative 15, and I'm going to put 0 in for T. And then, of course, do the math. So 0 minus 5, I'll put the pointer over here. 0 minus 5 is negative 5, but the absolute value of that is positive 5. So that's going to be negative 15 times 5 plus 120. And negative 15 times 5 is negative 75. Negative 75 plus 120 is 45. So I know this lowest point here is going to be 0. Well, not the lowest point, but the month 0 is going to be at 45. So I could kind of estimate that right there. And then maybe I'll go to the extreme of the 12th month. So let's see, I'm just going to take this 0 over here. I'm just going to overwrite it using a different color. If that's okay, I'm going to change 0 to 12. And 12 minus 5 is 7, and the absolute value of that is still 7. And negative 15 times 7 is negative 105, and negative 105 plus 120 is 15. So that point, this point here, is going to be 12 and 15. So if I go over to the 12th month, I would go up to roughly 15. Now, it's definitely lopsided, and actually that's okay because the directions say to graph from 0 through 12. So that is definitely good enough. I would still probably go through, sorry my lines aren't perfect here, but I would probably still go through and just double check, if I went down roughly 15 over 1, yep, down 15 over 1, yep, you're there, so you're good. Then last but not least, just a few quick questions here. Number 2 says, what is the maximum number of sales in 1 month? In what month was that maximum reached? Well, I think that is probably very obvious to you that this point up here is our maximum, and that point is our vertex, 5, 120. Now interpret what that means. It's the 5th month, so that would be May, and the sales were 120. And let's see, or I'm sorry, the number of boats sold. So the maximum number of sales was 120 boats. So just interpreting what those numbers mean in context to the problem. And then last but not least, what is the minimum number of sales in 1 month? And what month was that minimum reached? So again, kind of looking here, you have two minimums, and it's clear that this is more minimal than the 0th month. So that would be in what month? December, because that's the 12th month. And we know that that was 15 boats sold.